you've kind of taken a data-driven approach to trying to understand what will happen. Because I think one of the questions that people have, as Burhan pointed out, is, okay, let's see that I, you know, support this and or recommend changes, but in some one way or another, it gets approved. What changes when? What can we expect to change? Can you talk a little bit about when you've looked at Roslindale through your lens? What do you see as the potential for change?
After zoning, changes tend to happen incrementally over time. And what we've kind of used as a base point is basically, uh, 10% of lots that seem like they are now eligible for redevelopment to be redeveloped over a 10-15 year period. And looking at data across Massachusetts, that's fairly consistent as well. But of course, any type of zoning change ultimately is also dependent on economic factors. And, right now we're in a particularly challenging time for projects to pencil. And that really just means that a project makes sense financially for somebody to take on and for them to be able to pay their staff and the architects and the lawyers and the banks to finance it. And so in our current high interest rate environment, financing a project can be very challenging. And so that's why we've seen that slowdown of projects, certainly post-pandemic. What we've done in partnership with a number of community groups in Roslindale was look at the zoning code as it had existed, as it exists today, applying some of the new districts that Abdul and his team have worked on. And we had come up with what we'd call kind of a minimum scenario and an abundance scenario. And so kind of in the most conservative set of changes, we saw, maybe 300 units. So very small, very modest. In a more abundant scenario, up to 1,500. And that was kind of looking at applying some of those S2, S3 districts. Now looking at the draft zoning that their team has put out, what we've seen is actually taking a middle ground. We're kind of estimating over the next 10 years, less than 1,000 housing units. So of course, if you look at the broader context, 1,000 units may sound like a lot, but relative to existing population growth in Roslindale, between 2010 and 2020, the population grew about 2% or so. And so if we add, just as an example, about, say, 800 units, if we assume each unit brings in about 2 residents or so, that's less than 2,000 extra residents in Roslindale, and that's about 6%. Just as a comparison point, in that same period from 2010 to 2020, Boston as a overall population grew about 13%. And so that's about half of the growth that the city saw overall. So again, a fairly modest change over a long period of time is kind of what we're expecting to see based off of the zoning that's being proposed.
And what were the assumptions you made in the projections you made in terms of what could get developed where?
When we were doing the analysis, what we basically had made an assumption around is projects that are only incrementally adding density are probably not a good candidate for ground up redevelopment. So you can imagine if you have something 3 stories today, now you're upzoning it up to 4. Just as an example, you maybe want to add that additional floor on top if it's structurally sound. Otherwise, you're probably not going to tear it down just to add a little bit more. So our assumption kind of assumes that somebody would only redevelop if it's more than 2.5 times in terms of floor area. We're also looking at building age as well. So something that was built in the last 10 years, probably still a suitable, usable building. It's really kind of the older ones that make sense for perhaps building something different. And I mentioned earlier, one of the main assumptions that we're making is kind of that 2% a year development rate as well.
I'll just end with, I think of zoning as something that takes effect in the scale of decades, and doesn't really change your neighborhood in the scale of years. And I think especially in this moment where not only Cambridge and Boston, but the rest of the state is also rezoning, we will see very modest change all throughout the state rather than, dramatic change overnight or even over the next 5 or 10 years. I think it'll be pretty slow rolling.